All right, good evening. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Pat Kowitzel. I am the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we are excited tonight to present the next in our series of virtual events. We are now in July, believe it or not. If you're joining us from Tulsa, it is hard to believe that this is July since it's in the 80s and raining, and we don't have that kind of weather here in the summer usually. And we are, we've been doing the virtual events now for well over a year. We started in April of last year doing virtual programming, and we actually have some in-person events that are coming up, and we are really excited to have a couple of those. Our website, magiccitybooks.com, is the best place to see all the information about upcoming events, and we hope you check that out and see the things that are coming up. But we've got a couple later this month that we're going to be doing in person, and then hopefully a little bit more and more as the summer and fall move through. We also record all of these programs, and they are available on our YouTube channel, and so you can check us out on YouTube. By searching Magic City Books, we have over 140 author programs that we've done virtually since last April that have been recorded and are posted up there with authors from all over, truly all over the world. We've had people joining us from Europe, a number of authors joining us from Europe. I think one or two even have joined us from Asia as well. So we've got a great set of programs that are there as well that you can go back and watch. A few months ago, I was sent an early copy of the book that we are here to discuss tonight, Morningside Heights by Joshua Henkin, and started reading it right away. Was just completely drawn into this story, and it was one that I didn't want to put down, and I didn't want it to end. It's an outstanding book, and you don't even have to take my word for it. It is the #1 pick for Indie Next in June. So independent booksellers from around the country all agreed with that sentiment. It is just a fantastic book about a family. There's a lot of entry points, I think, to this book, and I know that we will kind of discuss all of those tonight. We are really lucky tonight to also be welcoming the novelist Joan Silber for our program tonight. Joan is most recently the author of a book called Secrets of Happiness that was the Magic City Books subscription pick for the month of May for our fiction pick. And Magic City has a subscription box that you can choose, and we send a book directly to your door. We pick it from all the books that are published in a month. There's truly hundreds and hundreds of books that are published every month, and so just because we didn't pick one doesn't mean that it isn't worthy, but the ones that we do pick we're very, very proud of, and so we were really excited to have Joan's book be our May pick. And both of our guests tonight are joining us from, as the crow flies, not very far apart, but quite far from us. Both of them are in New York and not too far away from each other, but a couple, about 1,400 miles away from us here in Tulsa. So one of the great things about these virtual events is that we're able to bring two authors together to have this conversation. And we are just so thrilled tonight to be welcoming Joshua Henkin and Joan Silber in conversation. I will now pass it over to Joan. Thank you very much for joining us. Enjoy the show.
Thank you. I am totally glad to be here. I just want to say this is a wonderful event for me, and I'm a great fan of this book. I just think it's a remarkable book. I wanted to start off by saying that. The sort of most obvious question, of course, to start with is, where the book came from, where you got the idea. But before I ask that, I want to say how hard it is to write about what you wrote about. So, and I'll say more about that in a second. So not only is it the obvious question, oh yeah, where'd you get the idea? It's like, where did you get the nerve to think you could do it? So, and how did you kind of go through the process of deciding how to do it? So that's what I'm asking first off. Where did it come from?
So first of all, Joan, I want to say how thrilled I am to be, just to tell everyone, so Joan and I have known each other for years. We used to be colleagues at Sarah Lawrence, but I'm such a big fan of your work, Joan. And Secrets of Happiness is just like another great book of yours. And so anyhow, I'm really honored. And I just wanted to start with that. So yeah, so Morningside Heights is about a long marriage, and it follows Pru Steiner as from childhood in a certain way, and through college, and she goes to grad school and falls in love with her professor, and they end up getting married, and things happen differently from what she anticipated. And when he's in his 50s, Spence, her husband, starts to get confused and eventually is diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And so, well, I mean, I guess the book is inspired by my father, who was a professor at Columbia and who himself had Alzheimer's. I mean, fortunately, he got it much later than Spence did, but it's not a disease that you pair the word fortunate with too much. He got it in his late 80s, but he was still teaching at the time. But I think the real inspiration was that when my dad was declining, my mother took a class at the Upper West Side Jewish Community Center in Manhattan for caregivers. And this really struck me because my mother is not a consorting with strangers kind of person. And I was interested in sort of like, what had befallen her such that she would seek solace in the company of people whom she may not have had much in common with, except for the fact that they were all caregivers. And the novel started out as a very long short story that took place almost entirely among the people who met each other at the JCC. It took me 8 years to write the book. I wrote 3,000 pages. It's a lot changed. But by the 9th or 10th draft, the JCC was gone, and it became apparent to me that I was really interested in this family and in this marriage. And in some ways, specifically, I'm interested in all my characters, but in some ways, I was interested in it specifically less from Spence's perspective than from the other characters' perspectives. I mean, we are in Spence's perspective sometimes, but we're never in his perspective as he's declining. In large part because, I don't know, it didn't interest me that much. I mean, you can do that well. And I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but I think one of the challenges of writing about Alzheimer's is that medically speaking, there's no tension there. I mean, the person is going to decline. And so, I mean, I tell my grad students, don't write a story about a ball rolling down a hill because, the ball is going to roll down the hill. And so the tension really had to reside in the characters who were still lucid, who had agency, and who were making choices with respect to Spence. So he's kind of the engine that drives the book. But I was particularly interested I'm interested in them all in different ways. But, Pru, it was a woman who was very accomplished. She went to Yale, she started grad school at Columbia, and then she kind of really gave up her career and, hitched her herself to a star man. And I was interested in what that's like when her identity was so attached to Spence's success, and then when he starts to lose his identity, what happens to her? So that was, I'd say, the inspiration from the germ for the book.
I love what you're saying about the ball rolling downhill, because I was so aware as I was reading that's the way you managed to avoid the danger of that. I think just the challenge in this kind of material is to get a story out of it. The story is for me at least, the story is the other people and how they, particularly Pru, but the others around her, how they deal with it. I was just so impressed with it because if I, told anyone, a group of students or anyone, write a novel about a dire disease, that's not on the face of it a promising topic. And yet, I just think, it's extraordinary what you did with it. This is a real story, a real novel. Where did you get stuck as you were working? What was the hardest part?
So I'd say a couple of things, and I've been meaning to thank you specifically for unsticking me. You don't know how you unstuck me, but I'm about to tell you. So I guess that there were two ways in which you helped me with one of the ways in which I was stuck. The other way was no one could help me but me. But so it sort of harks back to what you were saying before. Yeah, I think if you think about writing a book about a horrible disease, that is an unpromising thing to do. And so it was very important to me that the book, like, I don't really see the book as being about a disease. I mean, obviously it is, but it's about it's really about a very long marriage. And I'm thinking about your own book, about your own craft book about time and fiction, in which I teach. And I thought a lot about the issue of time in this book. And so there are various things I needed to do to try to avoid the problem of the ball rolling down the hill. So one of them was Arlo, who is Spence's son from a previous marriage. Just tell people who haven't read the book, Spence was previously married, disastrous brief marriage, and there was a son that came out of that marriage. Arlo and the parents divorced when Arlo was 8 months old. And Arlo's mother is a hippie of sorts, and she wants to poop in all 50 states. And she said, basically, takes Arlo around with her. And Arlo comes and lives with Spence and Pru for a couple of years when he's a teenager. And it's a sort of a disastrous 2 years because Spence is successful in a traditional way that Arlo is not. Arlo is dyslexic. And I'm probably telling too much, but I'm just using that as a backdrop, which is to say that, well, it wasn't until well into the writing of the book that I even thought of Arlo. But I think I was looking for an Arlo, by which I mean I was looking for someone that was going to blast the book open in various ways. And I think, so I said to myself, well, what if Spence had a son from a previous marriage? And I first thought, nah. But I'm a big believer in not censoring yourself too early, so I started to write Arlo. And in certain ways, the book really took off from writing him. Like, his voice really came to me, and I was interested in this guy who's both so angry and so needy, and really the one character in the family who doesn't do what's expected of him. And I was interested in that. But, and here's where you come in, the book posed certain structural challenges, specifically surrounding Arlo, because what I needed to do was to, Arlo is, absent for long periods of time, and then he comes back in, and he kind of steals the show when he's there, but then he disappears. And I needed in some way structurally to be able to evoke both his presence and his absence. And I was really struggling with the structure of the book. And, I had recently read Rebecca Mackay's The Great Believers, which is a book I like a lot.
I love that.
It's a really great book. And I think I was really influenced initially by just to tell people who don't know that book, there are two narratives in that book. There's a kind of a 1980s Chicago AIDS narrative, and then there's a contemporary missing person in Paris narrative, to be a little glib. And that book goes back and forth in pretty rapid order between the two narratives. So it bops back and forth. And part of the structure of that book is a kind of jigsaw puzzle that in some way reminds me of some of your, but not all of your books, Joan. But in other words, where you're sort of trying to piece together the different characters' relationships to each other. There's a kind of slightly jigsaw puzzle in a good way feel to that book. And I think I was under the influence of that book, and that's the right structure for that book, but it wasn't the right structure for my book because there are multiple narratives in my book, but all the characters are, like, it's very clear what the characters' relationships are to each other. They're all, it's immediate family. I mean, the main characters, aside from the caregiver, Ginny, whom I'd also like to talk about at some point, but I mean, the main characters are Spence, Pru, Sarah, Arlo, and to some extent, I guess, Spence's sister and Spence's ex-wife. I mean, in other words, the things are not sort of, in terms of relationship, as far-flung as they are in some of your work, Joan, and also in Rebecca's book. And so I think that structure wasn't working for me, and I was just having a lot of trouble. And then I was asked to blurb your book, Improvement. And I don't know, I love that book. And I wish I could remember what it was in that book. I think I just got that book in my hands at the right time. Like, if I'd gotten it earlier, it might not have, I would have still loved it, but it wouldn't have helped me in the same way. And I kept meaning to email you about this, and I never did. So now I'm telling you right now, there is something about that book that helped me figure out how to structure it in 8 parts. I was in earlier drafts, there was too much pinballing. Like there would be, a brief chapter, as Spence is declining, a brief chapter in Arlo's childhood, a brief chapter when Sarah's out in LA, a brief chapter when Sarah's at Reed. There was something about the structure that didn't allow the reader to settle in for any period of time. And so it was kind of confusing, but and confusing not in a good way. Um, and so, anyhow, shortly after I finished Reading Improvement, I figured out the structure, but it was a long time coming to figure it out. So thank you. But that was one structural. That was one problem. The other struggle was really more emotional than aesthetic. Although I want to get to the emotional thing in a second, but I just want to say one more thing because I know that you and I share. I mean, we're not unique at this, but you and I share a love for Alice Munro. And one of the things I've learned from you and I've learned from Alice Munro is that structure can be beautiful. The right choices about structure, what you reveal when, how you layer your stories, how you layer your novels. That's an aesthetic decision that has beauty. And I'm sure you know this from teaching MFA students, is that, we will frequently have students, I should speak for myself, but I imagine this is familiar to you too. My students, by and large, write a wonderful sentence. They have a real gift with character. They struggle with narrative. And many of them, it's a kind of defensive pose, but many of them, at least initially, have a kind of contempt for narrative. That, that's, it's what I have to pay attention to that sort of because, you just sort of have to. But they do it really begrudgingly. I think it's a defensive pose. I'm usually able over the course of 2 years to disabuse them of that. But I actually try to make the stronger point, which I think that narrative, if done well, it can be really beautiful. It's not just something you have to do because you need to tell a story. There's the way you structure something is, as I said, is an aesthetic decision. But yeah, so the emotional thing that I was struggling with was Walter. So Walter, just tell everyone.
Well, we should say who Walter is for the people. Go ahead.
So, Walter is the one character who remained from the early JCC draft. All the other characters went. So once I got rid of the JCC, I had to introduce Walter in a different way. So yeah, without giving away too much, Walter is a character whom Pru takes up with. There's some possibility of a romantic relationship with Walter. I don't want to say much more than that in the book. And this is while Spence is still alive. And the psychological hurdle for me was that in earlier drafts, Walter was there. And, I showed my book to a few trusted readers early on. And they all said, well, yeah, Walter's an interesting character. And I like the scenes with him and Pru, but there's no tension there. Like, why are they getting together? And the reason they weren't getting together was because I was worried about my mother. My mother, there's a whole lot that's invented in the book. But Spence is very deeply inspired by my father, and Pru, somewhat less so, but still, is inspired by my mother. My mother, my dad died 11 years ago now. My mother was, and to this day remains, extremely loyal to my father's memory. And without placing any judgment on my mother or on Pru, everyone makes different kinds of decisions because every person is different. But my mother would have been horrified to take up with another man while my father was alive, even if he was, totally out of it. And I was worried about what my mother's reaction would be to a character who I think if she read the book, she did read the book, a character modeled on her who did something that I think she would not have countenanced. But I should have given my mother more credit because she's a smart, sophisticated fiction reader. And she understands that the ways in which fiction, even if it's borrowed from life, ways fiction works are complicated. And when I told her that, I decided I had to do this for the book. And I told her about it, and she didn't bat an eye. And then I thought something interesting happened after I wrote the book because I felt I learned something about my family, about myself, and just my feelings about things from writing the book. Because one thing that's striking to me in this book is that Prue does take up with Walter, but she remains super loyal to Spence, maybe even more so than she was before. And I think that I had this really kind of false dichotomy in my mind, this idea about loyalty and betrayal, that like of necessity, um, what Prue did was the betrayal. And I think I look at it much more, like in a much more complicated fashion now that I wrote the book and lived with Prue and Spence and saw what happened. So yeah.
I just want to say that as you're speaking, when I'm thinking that the quality of kind of moral deliberation that you're talking about and delicacy about the characters is one of the reasons it's such a good book. I mean, it's so much more sort of particular and kind of, I mean, the ethical and all of the other components are so alive in all the characters. I think it's quite different than what we're often given about families. I just think it's, I'm not quite saying this right, but I think it's the way you're speaking indicates what a substantial book it is. I mean, that's really a big part of it. And I'm glad that my time book helped. Oh, and that improvement helped you too.
Well, an improvement helped me in this book, but the time book helps my students. We read it every year in craft class, and we read it toward the end of the semester because it wouldn't work toward the beginning of the semester. It's too it's really too high level for them at the beginning of the semester. By the end of the semester, they're ready for it. Did you enjoy writing that time book?
I'm sorry,
Did you enjoy writing the book on time?
I did, although I had to revise it for the publisher for Grey Wolf, and I was just outraged. And of course, it's much better for my having modified some stuff in response to.
Why did you have to revise it?
I can't remember what they suggested. Because it's been 15 years, but there was some part that they wanted built out a little more, defended a little, some argument made more strongly, and I was so indignant. And you're totally right. I mean, it's the way revision always is. I have to change it. No, it's fine the way it is. But I did have a good time writing it. And for me also, it embodied my teaching and the fact that that's in something, more or less permanent. Was important to me, that something was carrying that. This is a lighter question, but I see that the book was delayed because of COVID. Many books were not. Why did they choose to delay your book? How did that work?
I don't look a gift horse in the mouth. In that I don't know why they chose my book, but I know that I'm really happy they did.
Yeah.
Because June 2020 was was obviously a very hard time in the world, and we're not out of the woods yet. But obviously, publishing a book in June 2021 is a better time to publish a book than in 2020. Yeah. So, my agent pushed hard for them to delay the book, but I'm sure there are a lot of agents that pushed hard, and why but I'm really grateful, and also they did a weird thing because So I always tell, it was weird to have it delayed because, it's like, I wouldn't know this from experience, but my friends told me it's like carrying a baby post-term. And I kind of felt as like what I imagined that would be. Because the book was in galleys, it was totally ready to go. And then they just said, we're waiting a year. So I always tell my students that when their books are coming out, and I tell myself this too, like, I think it's really good to be on a new project. And but I've never been able to do that because just the way the publishing cycle works, by the time you're finally done, you finish copy editing and then you do proofreading and then, you have to do whatever you do for the book to come out and help in whatever ways you can. There's just no time. But I was kind of given a free year, which was incredible. And I was fortunately on leave in the fall. So I got it was very fast for me. I got most of a draft of a new novel done. It's horrible, but I think things have to be bad before they're good.
Yeah.
So, and I just hate first draft. I love revision. So just to have 300 pages of words on on paper or on the screen. It's great. So in all ways, I feel really grateful for having the book delayed.
It's a wild, it's a wild thing to happen, to have happened. The delay.
Right.
That.
Although certainly among all the wild things that have happened in the past 15 months, that pales in comparison to
Right. It's small. That's true. That's true.
a small wild thing in a world of big wild things.
I have another question, which is how alike and not alike do you feel it is to your other books?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I kind of feel like in certain ways, like if I think as a writer, I would say my books are pretty different. By which, but these are writerly kind of things. Like I do, when you just, and I'm sure you know this too, Joan. Like when you're going to spend, as we do, a number of years with a book, you want it to be interesting to you, because otherwise, I mean, if you get bored, that's bad, and that's really bad because the reader's certainly going to be bored. I mean, it's possible the reader will still be bored even if you're not bored, but it's certainly necessary, if not sufficient, to not be bored. But I also think of my books sort of, and I think a lot in terms of craft, as sort of rebounds. It's kind of like the way relationships are sometimes rebounds. So, The World Without You takes place over 3 days. This book and Matrimony take place over much longer periods of time. Swimming Across the Hudson was first person. I mean, but all the things that I talk about in terms of that feel like significant differences. But I think if you're talking to the average reader, I kind of feel like in terms of the voice and the sensibility and the world that I write about, I think there's a similarity. I mean, I tend to write, it's on the sentence level. I mean, I'm very, very compulsive on the sentence level. I can spend, years just changing dialogue tags. But in general, like, I tend to, like when my work is working, I tend to write prose where I feel like the writer needs to get out of the way. And so that's the kind of writing I tend to like most. Not that I don't like some show-offy writing, it's just not how I do things. So I think if you look at the sensibility, the world I'm writing about, I tend to write about hyper-educated, urban, often Jewish, but not always Jewish people. I would say there's a real similarity, but when you get into the weeds, things are more different. I mean, it's interesting that question is interesting to me in general, because I do think there are writers. There are great writers who kind of write the same book over and over again. And there are great writers who write radically different books. Right. I mean, you think like someone like Philip Roth falls in the category of someone who writes the same book over and over again. Whereas Jennifer Egan or Jane Smiley, their books are each. It's like, wow, I wouldn't know this was a Jenny Egan or Jane Smiley book. So I think most of us, we're not necessarily as extreme as those examples, but most of us fall into one category or the other. And I probably would think that I'd fall a little closer to the Philip Roth category of writing about the same world as opposed to writing radically different books. But I think, once you get into the weeds, they feel pretty different. Well, how about, what do you feel about your work in terms of that?
I feel like the last 5 books, which follow the same form, are in some ways part of a continuing project, even though they don't connect with each other. But I'm striving for the same kinds of design as I do it, so they have a similarity.
Right, so these kind of loosely linked connections, and you see how the tapestry gets braided. And do you anticipate that that's how you're going to continue to like this longer project?
Yes, I feel like I've done my best work in that form, so I'm going to stick to it. But I have another question to ask you, which has to do with, I think of you as a writer who uses social detail, really, and not only is it sort of vibrant and uncliched in the way that you do it, but it's also, it has to do with the plot. I mean, for instance, Spence's sense of himself has to do with how he places in the world that he's in and the different parts of it. So I want to hear what you say about that generally, and then I want to talk about how you use the two caretakers in the story who are from a different world.
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing you're saying is like, I just want to make sure I understand. You're asking like how social detail in my work intersects with narrative. I mean, with narrative, is that?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to ask. Yes, thank
Uh,
you.
yeah, I guess. So I think as James Salter said, "Life is meals, life is weather," and I kind of feel that that the small things in life are most revealing. And I don't know. People do talk about like plot and character as distinct entities, but I actually really look at them as so intertwined as to make it impossible to disentangle. We both create our stories and are created by them, and I think that and our friend Charlie Baxter talks about these kinds of things uh, in his book "Burning Down the House," um, about getting your characters into trouble and about narrative conflict. And so it's very hard for me to think about character independent of the kinds of social detail that narrative brings to the fore. And I guess I'm speaking a little too vaguely, but I'm interested in the small things.
Yeah.
Uh, and I guess what I mean by that is that, in this book, there are certain scenes that, sort of objectively speaking, in terms of what's happening, are bigger. For instance, when Spence gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's, he goes in for this mini mental exam, and this genius guy can no longer name him the president of the United States or count backward by 7. Or when he's finally let go at Columbia and the chair of the English department calls Pru in. Those feel like bigger scenes in the sense like they're scenes that are kind of like, those are moments that you expect. They're kind of watershed moments. I think they're important moments. You have to do everything well, but I think they're important moments to get right. But in some ways, I'm more interested in the smaller, unexpected moments. So I'm thinking, for instance, of like there's a scene while Spence is declining where there's a mouse in the house, mouse in the apartment, and Prue wants to do the sensible thing, or what most people would do, which is just set mouse traps. But Spence wants to catch the mouse with his own 2 hands, which is obviously a silly thing to do, but it's also particularly unspence-like because Spence is like a guy who only begrudgingly accepts that he has a body, and so acts of physical prowess are not at all what he's about. But of course, what he really can't deal with is the fact that he's no longer able to write the book that been he's commissioned to write, and he kind of displaces that on trying to perform some sort of act of physical heroism that that Prue isn't interested in, and that he, in his right mind, himself wouldn't be interested in. And so I'm interested in those moments in fiction, as those narrative moments that reveal character that are a little unexpected, like the mouse. I don't know if that's answering your question, but I mean, I guess that's kind of how I look at the relationship between, as you're saying, social detail and and narrative. Um, so yeah, in terms of Ginny, so Ginny is the caregiver. So yeah, unlike Arlo, who came in late, Ginny I knew was going to be in the book um, from the very beginning. So Ginny, just to tell people who haven't read the book, Ginny is a single mother. She's Jamaican. She has a son named Rafe, who's a hemophiliac. He's a high school kid. They live in East New York, and Ginny is hired as the caregiver for Spence when Spence is declining. And Ginny, is inspired by um, my mother's experience and my brother's and my experience when my father was declining. Is that my mother is a good deal younger than my father, and she was certainly involved in his care, but she also had a job and she had other things going on in her life. And so she hired, my father for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, had full-time care. And to me, that relationship is among the more loaded complicated relationships out there for any number of reasons. I mean, what frequently happens, and I think it's fair to say it happens in Pru's case, is Pru tries to pretend, tries to convince herself, and actually says as much. She like thinks of Ginny. She's like an adjunct member of the family, but Ginny is not a member of the family. Ginny has her own family. Ginny's a hired employee. Usually, when the employer, even well-intentioned employers like Pru, think of their employees as members of the family, that is a way, even if it's not conscious, of giving themselves license to take advantage and to make boundaries that shouldn't be porous. And so there are huge issues of class here, and there are often, and in this case, there are issues of race, and power and money. And, I'm very much not a political writer. I'm a very political person, but in other words, I just think about my characters. I'm never trying to make a point, but I think, it's pretty obvious that, when you start to write about that kind of relationship, there are all sorts of complexities that get touched upon, and more than touched upon. But I was also interested in that relationship for additional reasons that are related to what I was saying, but that don't perfectly overlap with what I was saying. And that's that, when you're writing about family, as I generally do, even if your scene is taking place in a particular moment in time, there is either explicitly or at least implicitly just a lot of history there. Whereas the caregiver relationship in this instance, you have someone who goes from being a complete stranger to an incredible intimate in no time. It's 0 to 60 in no time. And then when the patient dies, the caregiver who was once described as a member of the family turns out, well, they're not a member of the family because the employer doesn't need them any longer, and they have to find a new job. So that move from utter stranger to intimate to a kind of stranger again is an unusual relationship. I think it's really interesting fodder for fiction. Then in addition, there's a scene that's no longer in the book, but I think the spirit of it is still in the book. So the scene that was cut was that at some point when Spence is in bad shape, he's in bed in the back of the apartment. He calls out, and Pru comes running, and he says, "No, I want Ginny." And that moment of sort of like Spence preferring Ginny to Pru, well, that's a very complicated moment in itself. I mean, obviously Spence and Pru had a very good marriage, and obviously he loves Pru in a way that he doesn't love Ginny. But I think late in my father's disease, the caregiver knew him in a certain way better than my mother knew him. I mean, in the case of Spence, Ginny knows how he likes his grapefruit cut, and she probably even knows some things about his body that Pru doesn't know. Late in his life. So I think that from Pru's perspective, to have him prefer Ginny is probably heartbreaking in some way, but it's also in a weird way a relief that she doesn't have to deal with things that she doesn't want to deal with, that it gives her a breather. But everything starting with the power dynamics in that relationship are what makes it made that relationship for me such an interesting one to write about.
They're great characters too. They're very full characters, I thought. I have actually two more questions. One is, who are the writers who were important to you and who you think you were formed by?
Oh, I hate that. It's a very important question. I hate that question because then after that, like, why didn't I say?
Right. Yeah.
I do feel like Charlie Baxter's work was very. I studied in Michigan with Charlie. His work and his teaching were very important to me. But a real wide array of people. I feel like because I write about families over the long haul, there's certain like certain kind of marriage books that were important to me, like Crossing the Safety by Stegner.
Yeah.
The novel that's really important to me. Revolutionary Road by Yates. I think, the Mr. and Mrs. Bridge books.
Oh,
And then, I in general, I mean, if you weren't asking me, I would say you. I will say you, but it feels too easy to say you. But as I told you, Improvement really changed this book for me in ways. I guess in general, I like fiction that, as I said before, that that focuses on the small details and recognizes that the small is large and the large is sometimes small. I like writing that is beautiful in an understated way. Um, so I think Elizabeth Strout. I'm like
oh,
Kittredge. I love Elizabeth, but all her work.
yeah.
Uh, and well, I think did you blurb this book? I'm just finishing up Peter Ho Davies's new novel,
Oh,
uh,
yes. Oh,
which I think is great. I think it's a great book. I think it's a really courageous book. To write about to write about fatherhood and art, and yeah, in that way, yeah. Um, so I like Sally Rooney's books. I didn't expect to just because she's so popular.
yeah.
Uh, but I especially liked Conversations with Friends more than Normal People. I like Normal People, but I thought Conversations with Friends, I don't know. She really writes about characters kind of hanging out and doing nothing in a way that, especially for someone so young, is really impressive. I liked Elif Batuman's The Idiot. This is I prefer to say like books I've read recently that I've liked rather
Yeah.
than who, because it's hard to know who influences you. I just finished the first novel by Christine Smallwood called The Life of the Mind. Uh,
Oh,
Very voicey, very different work from my own work, but I was really struck by it. Um, but Laurie Moore was very influential for me in the way that she, because people have said to me about this book, they've said, well, this book, you'd think it'd be so depressing because it's about a depressing topic, but it's really not that depressing a book. There's a lot of humor. How do you, people say, well, do you decide it's time for humor? And I just don't even look at things that way. I kind of feel like, and I think that Laurie Moore is a good example of a writer who understands that the humor and poignancy are so enmeshed that they're one and the same, and things that are funny are sad, and things that are sad are funny. On a line level, she's a very different writer from me, but I feel like I learned a lot from her, um, and from her stories, especially. So, um, so those are some people who've been influential.
so my last question is what you're working on next, or working on now, actually.
Yeah.
What's
Well,
next?
yeah. And then I'm going to ask that question right back to you. So, yeah, I mentioned that I wrote this almost a draft of a novel, but as I said, it's really bad. But I'm hoping that someday it will be good. And it's an unusual book for me. I think in some way, I was thinking about this with you guys before, or are my books similar? And I think in some ways it will feel similar in that the prose style will feel similar and the world I'm writing about will feel similar. But there is, first time I've ever done this, there is a speculative, I don't want to be specific yet,
Ah,
but there is a speculative premise at the heart of the book, which I've
that is
never.
a change.
Yeah, it is a change. I feel inspired in some way. Another book that I've read recently that I loved um, was Kevin Wilson's "Nothing to See Here." I don't know if you've read that
I
book.
haven't read it, but I know what it is. Yeah.
It's I really love that book. It's a novel about it's a novel about a young woman who um, who comes from the wrong side of the tracks and went to prep school. This is all backstory. Went to prep school on scholarship, and her roommate, who is from royalty, I can't remember what the roommate got in trouble for something. I think probably drug related, and the father of the roommate paid the protagonist off to take the fall. And so she got kicked out of school instead of the wealthy kids. So that's the background to the story. But in the here and now of the novel, this woman who's probably now in her probably 30s, I think, is contacted by her old prep school roommate, who's now married to a senator, I think from Tennessee, who's in line to become Secretary of State. And she's called to be the nanny for the senator's kids from the first marriage. And the thing about these kids is that they go on fire whenever they get emotional.
Yes, in the pictures on the cover.
So that is the speculative premise. But, as Flannery O'Connor has said, in writing Mystery Manners she's talking about good country people, but she talks in general, she doesn't use the word speculative, but when you're writing, which I think the word she uses is surreal, I don't even know what word she used, but, it's harder because it has to work both on a realist and on a metaphorical level. And a lot of the speculative work that I read, and it's probably why I don't gravitate to it that much, is that it only works on a metaphorical level. It doesn't feel inhabited. And what's really wonderful about this book of Kevin Willis is you're not really thinking about the metaphors. And it's actually a kind of an incredible meditation on taking care of children and on motherhood in a certain way. Even though this protagonist is not a mother, she's a surrogate mother, because the real mother isn't on the scene. The stepmother is too busy being the wife of the senator who's going to become Secretary of State. So the protagonist becomes a surrogate mother. It's a really moving and tender book with this also an incredibly smart narrative moment at the end. I don't know. I thought it's a terrific book, but I don't know if I was consciously influenced by that. But it did show me that you can write a book. You can write a book that's deeply about character, that's deeply human, that's deeply realist, while also being
Right.
So whether I pull it off, that's another question. But that's one thing I want. Then I've also been working on. I started this a while ago and I put it away, but I've been working on kind of a multi-generational saga like a Jewish saga that takes place over a number of. It's a big, ambitious book. I don't know what's going to come of it. And then I'm also working on some stories. I think what I see is a kind of a collection of linked stories, but they're linked differently from how your stories are linked. They're stories that each take place in a different neighborhood in New York. And so, I do think that Morningside, the neighborhood of Morningside Heights is a character in this novel. And so in these stories, the particular neighborhoods that I write about, I think in certain ways function as characters in those stories. So those are the three things I'm working on, and that may be a way of working on nothing. But what can you tell? You told me a little bit before we were live, but tell me a little bit about what you're working on.
What I'm working on, I'm working on a book of, again, linked pieces that begins with a character in the 1970s is shooting drugs with his friend, and he betrays him in some way. I don't want to give away all of it, but he's haunted his whole life by that and doesn't quite know the outcome of it. And then there are other characters who are dealing with their own regrets and moral lapses, and that kind of plays out in the book. And there's a lot about drugs in it. I'm reading about opium now in ways that are kind of interesting, and I have a section that's in Hong Kong.
And these are writer questions, but one of the things there's so many things I loved about Secrets of Happiness, but one of the things I loved, was you have 6 different first-person narrators. That is hard. That's a kind of act of ventriloquism. I'm trying to remember whether in The Sweet Hereafter, Russell Banks also, I think those might have been first. It's been a long time since I read that book, but I've seen. This sounds backhanded, but it's the furthest thing from it. I've just seen a lot of books where there are just multiple first-person voices that they either meld, or if they don't meld, they're so busy trying to show you that they're not melding that you become aware of that's what they feel performative. I found the the voices in your book to be distinct, but also effortlessly distinct. And I was just really interested in that. So I guess that's my way to ask. So, in your new book, is it first person, third person, a combination?
It's a combination so far. We'll see what happens. But I'm in what I refer to as the dopey stages, where I don't exactly know what I'm doing. There's something live in it, but there's a lot that is wavering and that is turning out to be different than I thought. But I'm sure you will second me on this. I love working. I'm really happy to be inside something. It's the
Yeah,
best.
that's the best time.
Yeah.
The worst time is when the book is coming out, about to come out, or when it's just going. I'm grateful to be able to talk to people like you, but as you know, I mean, it's like there's nothing better than actually. I mean, but when you're writing, you really have control. I'm not saying that you don't. I mean, you're not always going to get it right, but you can at least keep trying. Whereas once the book is out, everything is out of your control.
Yes, you're done with it. Yeah, you can't revise it.
I wish I could, but I mean,
Yeah.
I'm the kind of person who gives a reading and feels like, no, I should have. I was right to take out that dialogue tag. Why did I put it back in? But yeah, it's just being in the dopey stage is kind of fun, I think.
Well, I think you should be celebrating at this moment. I think this should be a, you know, a pumped up time for you because I think the book is so strong. We have to wrap it up. I think it's our time to conclude. Oh, excuse me, there is one question on the chat room. Someone wants to know, with the publication of this novel, what have you learned about yourself as a writer that has influenced your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure the publication of the novel is, I mean, well, I did say before the publication of the novel told me something about my feelings about loyalty when it comes to my mother and father and things like that. But in terms of, I mean, well, I kind of feel like I started out as a teacher, but kind of before I became a writer. So I was on a more traditional academic path when I went to college, and I studied political theory, and I always wanted to be a fiction writer, but I wanted to be in the MBA, and I knew that I was neither good enough nor tall enough. And that's kind of what I felt about fiction writing too, that I just couldn't do it. And so, but I moved out to Berkeley after I graduated from college. I grew up on the East Coast, and I moved out to California, and I was working for a magazine. And one of the things I was doing was I was the first reader of fiction manuscripts, and I saw how many horrible ones there were. And I didn't necessarily think I could do any better, but I thought if other people were willing to try and risk failure, I should be willing to try and risk failure too. And so I started taking some workshops. I went to Michigan to get my MFA, and I ended up taking the path I took. But I say this by way of saying that I have friends who are writers who are not good teachers and wouldn't want to teach, and it's not just because they don't gravitate toward it. I think that they don't think like a teacher. Where I come from a family of teachers, and I think I was at least initially less instinctive writer, and so I had to teach myself to become a more instinctive writer. And so for me, teaching and writing are inseparable. And a psychoanalyst friend I know talks about like how the analyst is in the pool with the patient. I kind of feel like the teacher is in the pool with the student. That I'm really not on shore. I'm in the water too, and I think that the things that my students are struggling with are the same things that I'm struggling with. And yeah, I've been doing it longer than they have, but I feel like in figuring out what's not working in their stories, I'm figuring things out for myself. But I guess to be a little more specific, I think that this is probably not true, not just in fiction, but in life. We see other people's mistakes more clearly than we see our own. And so I'm constantly making mistakes that that I tell my students not to make. And it takes me a while to realize that I'm making those same mistakes. So like I can give a couple of examples and then I guess we'll wrap it up. But So I'm often telling my students to avoid a little global, but I think I'll stand by this, to avoid the big reveal story, the big reveal novel. Because usually, although there are novels and stories that work that way, it doesn't really capture the reading experience. And a lot of my students, confuse confuse plot device with plot. They think of fiction as a Rubik's Cube, and I think fiction is not a Rubik's Cube. So, I mean, I'm talking too abstractly, but to give an example, so years ago I had a student, and she was actually a good writer, but she wrote a story, she was an undergraduate, she wrote a story about a husband and wife who are fighting, and it was a pretty well written story, but at the end of the story, you discover that the wife is not a wife, but a cat.
Oh,
And then you look back and you say, oh, yes, she was drinking a little strangely from that saucer. But at least in my opinion, the pleasures of being tricked in that way, or the pleasures of that discovery, are limited because it doesn't capture the reading experience, which is that you're reading as you go along. And so to realize that you were wrong all along, even if you take some pleasure in that, which I actually don't, but even if you do, it's a retrospective and retroactive pleasure. And so I think it's important to think of narrative as not these weird kinds of hooks and devices. So I wasn't quite doing that in this book, but in early drafts of the book, it took many, many pages for Spence to be diagnosed and for Pru to understand that he had dementia. The reader understood 200, I mean, this is when I had 3,000 pages. The reader understood 250 pages before the characters did. That to me is generally a mistake. In other words, when the reader understands something and is waiting for the characters to catch up with them in that sort of way, it's narratively dull. It made Pru more obtuse than she actually was. And so I needed to streamline things. I needed to get there. I think I mean, it's not a perfect analogy to certainly to what my student with the cat was doing. But what I'm trying to say is it was a contrivance. And I was trying to gin up the narrative, trying to generate suspense where there really wasn't any. And I just needed to tell the story. That's one example. The second example is I am always telling my students that they should kill their darlings. That, sometimes the scene that you love the most is the scene that is infecting the book or infecting the story. And so as one example, my favorite scene in this book to this day, it's still my favorite scene in the book, not in the book. And so to give some background, so originally Spence was an art historian. He was not a Shakespeare scholar. And this was clearly a mistake. I mean, first of all, I don't know enough about art history. I should know more, but I don't know enough, and so I wasn't doing a good job of it. But maybe even more important, Spence, to me, does not feel like an art historian because Spence is, as I was alluding to before, is deeply aesthetic. He wishes he didn't have a body. I mean, I guess you could have an aesthetic art historian, but there's something that's very physical about visual art. He just didn't feel like an art historian to me. And I had a couple early readers who basically said, Josh, not buying the art historian thing. And I basically agreed, but I really clung to it. And the reason I clung to it is I had this scene that I loved and that was really contingent on his being an art historian. And so, and this is a whole section of the book that's no longer there, but in this earlier incarnation, there was that Pru and Spence go to a family bat mitzvah, cousin, and Spence is in pretty bad decline, but he hasn't been diagnosed yet. And but he should have been diagnosed already. And he disappears for a period of time, and Pru can't find him. And then all of a sudden, she sees him, and it's the bat mitzvah slideshow, and the father of the bat mitzvah girl is up in front of the screen with a pointer, narrating the slideshow. And the girl is scuba diving in, the Indian Ocean. I mean, and she's playing tennis in the Catskills, and she's, hanging out with her grandparents. I mean, there are certain sort of like totemic bat mitzvah slide things that are being portrayed on the screen. And Spence steps forward out of the shadows, takes the pointer from the bat mitzvah girl's father, and while these slides are going on, starts to conduct an art history lecture. And and what he's saying is utterly, I mean, he's speaking in full sentences, knowledgeably about art history. I mean, it's brilliant, but it's also utter nonsense because what's on the screen is not Caravaggio, but the bat mitzvah girl. So if I'm allowed to say so, I think it's a really great scene. I mean, I think it captures, it's funny and poignant, and it captures the way that in a single moment, at certain points in the disease course, someone is both brilliant and totally incoherent. It's all distilled there, and I was so attached to the scene that I was kind of willing to, for a time, to fall on my sword and have him be an art historian, even though I knew he wasn't an art historian. So I wasn't willing to kill my darling. So I know this is long-winded, but that's my way of saying is that, I'm constantly relearning from teaching and from my students things that I've learned before, but seem to unlearn in the first draft or the first 10 drafts of every novel I write. But they're kind of there in the back of my mind as a kind of repository of lessons that I remind myself. So when I finally come to, I'm like, oh yeah, let's get rid of this plot device. Oh yeah, how about killing my darling?
I think this is a great note to end on, actually, because it's kind of about what we go through and what gets thrown out and what the sort of labor involved in writing that leads to the final, the sacrifice, I guess that's what I'm thinking of, that's for this, to us, higher goal in the name of it. Anyway, I want to thank you for this book because I think it's a terrific book.
Thank you so much. Actually, I'm just looking at the participants, and I want to say a quick hi to a bunch of people I recognize, but specifically to Lucy and Kathleen, who are old friends and colleagues of mine, and of Joan today. I want to thank you guys for getting on Zoom tonight, and thank you so much, Joan, for talking to me. I really loved it, and Pat, thank you for running this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Magic City. And thank you all for coming, because this is
Thank
great
you.
for us too.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.